All right, the skeletal muscle topic is what we're going to cover today. By the way, the pictures you see behind me, because I sit on my bed usually while I'm recording these, I don't want you to see my bedroom wall behind me, so I have these virtual backgrounds. They're all pictures that I've taken. This one is actually from my backyard in wintertime when there was a beautiful sunset. There's been no Photoshop or anything applied to it. Those were really the colors on that particular night. All right, so skeletal muscle is a little bit longer topic if we were to go into too much detail. But I really don't think we need to cover the minute details in order to understand what happens with aging. In fact, my rule of thumb is when it comes to skeletal muscle, anything that could slow down, slows down. That it's just the way that it is. Okay, so and we'll focus on a couple of other things. So skeletal muscle, we should know at least there's three types of muscle. Skeletal muscle, which of course connects to the bones and so forth, cardiac muscle from the heart, and then smooth muscle that lines hollow organs and can control their size and whether fluid will move through them or something like that. Skeletal muscle is connected to bone by tendons, and of course when the muscle contracts, it pulls on those tendons, pulls on the bones, and we're able to move. The individual muscle cells that make up skeletal muscle are called muscle fibers or myofibers. Myo means muscle, and that's because these are very long, thin cells. You cannot see them, they are so thin, you have to use a microscope, but they can be as long as about 30 centimeters because they run all the way from one end of a muscle to the other. The cells run the entire length. Well, how do you get a cell that long? Well, during development, cells actually line up end to end to end to end, and they all fuse together to make one big long cell. Well, that means that myofibers then, because there's multiple cells that all fuse together, are multinucleated. They have nuclei all the way down the length of the myofiber. These are just some brief steps of contraction here. To have contraction, we have to send a signal down the motor nerve fiber. These are the nerve fibers that innervate skeletal muscle and make it contract. And we have to generate a signal and send it down, or the muscle doesn't contract. Well, sometimes students will ask, well, why do I sometimes have muscle twitches then? Well, the nerve might be irritated, the muscle might be irritated. It could be a variety of factors, but that's not normal, right? That's not the normal way that we would initiate a contraction, and we have no control over that. That nerve fiber, when the signal reaches the end, releases a neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which then diffuses across this tiny gap between the end of the nerve fiber and the skeletal muscle, and that gap is called the synaptic cleft. And then on the muscle membrane, there's a receptor for that acetylcholine, the acetylcholine receptor, and it will, of course, bind to it. Well, that initiates some events that generates an electrical signal in the muscle membrane that penetrates inside the muscle and causes calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now, if you're listening to this thinking, sarcoplasmic reticulum, did I ever learn about that? If you're a biology student, you have. In fact, if you're a non-biology student, you might have in an introductory course, but it's just an organelle that stores calcium. And even the biology students don't always know, hey, it stores calcium, because in basic biology, it's taught as that's a minor thing. So it may not even be taught. But in skeletal muscle, it's a major thing that it stores calcium. And so when this acetylcholine is released from the nerve fiber, binds to its receptors, generates the electrical signal, calcium gets released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And it goes out and it binds, I'm telling you some steps you don't need to know. But that calcium then causes these two proteins, myosin and actin, to interact. And the myosin actually pulls on the actin, and you have so many, really hundreds of millions of these molecules inside a cell that all of them pulling will result in a shortening of that cell. And of course, if you shorten many myofibers, you can get the whole muscle to contract. Well, how do we then stop that and relax? Well, we have to have the nerve fiber stop sending a signal. The acetylcholine, which is still there, we have to get rid of it or we'll continue to have a contraction, but there's an enzyme called acetylcholine esterase that is present that breaks down the acetylcholine. And then the calcium that's on the interior of the muscle fiber actually gets pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And so now we can have a relaxation. And I mention relaxation because it's an important step. Yes, that slows down with age too. So it's not only contract, relax, it's contract, relax. And the relaxation step, because it's actually even longer, you can imagine that has functional implications for movement in general. We talk about muscle twitches. And so this is if we artificially stimulate one brief contraction, it will contract and relax. Well, we have two stages called the contraction phase and the relaxation phase. Okay. So here's the upshot. I used to go into more detail, and I finally just put this in. With aging, all steps take longer. Every single thing we talked about or could have talked about that I didn't even talk about, they all take longer. But that's not even the most important thing with aging. There's a few other things as well that we'll talk about. But now think about older people and why and how they're slower to move. The signal starts down it comes slower down the nerve fiber. The acetylcholine gets released more slowly. The electrical signal in the muscle is going more slowly. Calcium is released more slowly. The myosin actin, everything is slower, and so that makes every physical action just a little bit slower. That has, if you think in terms of driving and reacting, this is why some people are dangerous on the road when they get older, and I hate to say that, but it can be true. The reaction times can be slowed down by this as well, and that's where you haven't even talked about nervous system yet. That's really just all the muscle. But here's some changes that are more important for aging. There's something called the motor unit. And when that nerve fiber comes down and connects with the muscle fiber, the myofiber, it also connects with several other myofibers as well. That's a motor unit. One motor neuron and all of the myofibers it innervates. And there's many different motor units in a single muscle. And so I can recruit just one motor unit or another motor unit and then another motor unit, and I can add them on to get a stronger and stronger muscle contraction because I only need a few muscle fibers to contract for a weaker contraction. If I'm lifting my pen or I'm lifting a 50-pound dumbbell, it's going to require a different amount of muscle, and I can recruit those motor units as I need to. The problem is, with aging, there are fewer motor units. Some of those motor units are lost. The nerve fibers go away, but some of the remaining nerve fibers will go down and take over the other myofibers that are still there. And so now there are larger motor units. Larger motor units mean a less precision of muscle control. When you have very small motor units, you can do things like write clearly with your fingers and your hand. Your eyes can move very well to track things. But when you get larger motor units, you don't have that fine level of control anymore. Now think about the shakiness of someone's hand. No Parkinson's disease, just natural aging, and their signature is maybe not a little as clear, maybe a little more shaky because of this loss of control. There are, in general, if you ever take an exercise physiology class, you can go into far more detail on many of these, but in general, two muscle fiber types. Type 1, which is slow twitch. Type 2, which is fast twitch. Think about it for a moment. One, it's slow to contract. The other one is fast to contract. And actually, the slow one is slow to contract and relax, and the fast one is fast to contract and relax. And most of us, in general, are about 50-50. We got about 50% type 1, 50% type 2. If you have more type 1 fibers, that is generally associated with good health. Okay? That's when you're younger. When you're older, what happens is when you start to lose some muscle fibers, and that's what happens, there's actually this preferential loss of type 2 fibers. So you don't really lose many of the slow twitch, but you do lose many of those fast twitch. And so those muscle fibers are no longer there, no more fast twitch, everything is slow twitch. And now again, think in terms of responses and jumping and things that create where you need fast movement. They are impaired. Okay, so again, I don't want you to just think of the biology here. I want you to think about the functional implications. This loss of type 2 fibers is believed not just to be not just because the fibers disappeared, but because of the motor neurons, the motor unit that came down, that particular motor neuron disappeared. It was lost. And now that type 2 fiber is lost, or perhaps converted to a type 1. I don't want to go into all the details there, but that's a possibility as well. So you end up with a higher percentage of type 1 slow twitch fibers and a lower percentage of type 2 fast twitch fibers. This right here says use it or lose it. I should have put a question mark behind it. This is still controversial. If you recruit your type 2 fibers, in other words, you've got to pick up the pace on a lot of things. If you're out for a walk or a jog, you've got to go into a run. You've got to do jumps. You have to recruit more muscle. And you can't just start doing this at age 80. It's too late. You need to do it while you're younger. But remember when we talked about longitudinal studies, it's really hard to track whether this is causative or not. If people don't use it as much, is it still lost? Or is it lost to the same degree? And we really don't know that answer. But my solution is I make sure that I have some high impact, higher intensity activities in the things that I do. Maybe it won't help with the muscle loss. I really don't know because I said there's no evidence, but it can also get me in better health and better shape. So there's that effect at least. This last part here, I want to spend just a little bit of time on. These last two parts really. Satellite cells. When these myofibers are first made, some of the cells that fuse together to make them stay outside of the myofiber and they remain behind. These are satellite cells. And I have the definition here. They're muscle precursor cells, but they haven't been made into muscle yet. And they reside just outside the myofiber. Well, what are they there for? What do they do? Well, if that muscle is injured, and over time, all muscle gets injured or things need replaced, whatever it is, the satellite cell gets stimulated to divide. Signals are sent out, it divides. One daughter cell gets left behind. You got to leave one satellite cell there. You can't do without. The other one actually fuses. I'm sorry. Let me get to here. Differentiates into what's called a myoblast. It's just another cell type along this pathway. Then it fuses with the membrane of the myofiber and becomes part of the myofiber. Well, there was a nucleus in that satellite cell, and now we've got another nucleus to the myofiber to help make additional protein to do things like carry out repair and build up the muscle. And it's really thought that that's an important step in being able to respond to muscle injury, such as lifting weights or something like that, so that you can build a stronger muscle so that it won't get injured the next time. So it's a protective mechanism. But with aging, there are fewer satellite cells. There's not as many around. In addition, the ones that are there, they don't respond to the signals as well. So there's impaired recruitment of these satellite cells. Well, now if you add those two factors together, if you have muscle injury, it's going to be tougher to recover from that injury. It will take a longer period of time. It may not recover to the same extent as somebody who's younger. And why is this all true? My PhD advisor, and he has researched this and looked at a lot of the evidence, really believe that it is actually secondary to declines. These are endocrine issues where specific hormones are lost or decline. Specific growth factors, even though we don't call them hormones, are still circulating, so that they really would act as a hormone. And because these are lost, and it's not just one specific one, it's the cocktail of all of these different factors. So you just can't add one thing in and all of a sudden it will recover. It's how all of them are affecting it and how they all change with age. Finally, this word sarcopenia, and I'm going to put this in bold because I think that's important. Sarcopenia, there's not an official medical clinical definition. And even in the research literature, it can be quite difficult because what one person calls sarcopenia, another person doesn't. I'm giving you my definition, even though you couldn't use this in a research study because this would be hard to measure. You'd have to set some measure. But I like to think of it as the functional impairment of skeletal muscle because of age-related declines in muscle mass. We all lose muscle mass with age, but that's normal. It wouldn't become sarcopenia until it actually impairs function, our quality of life, our activities of daily living, or something like that. Then I would consider it sarcopenia. Here are two important points, and I want to highlight this especially in a biology of aging class. Okay, so let me just highlight this way. Okay, why do people go to care facilities when they're older? Yes, sometimes it's because of Alzheimer's disease or something like that. But the number one reason that people need to live in an assisted living facility is because of sarcopenia. It's because they've lost muscle mass and they can't get out of their chair. They can't wash the dishes. They can't get off the toilet. That's quality of life. Those are problems. And that's why they end up in nursing homes. In addition, I'm going to highlight this one as well. Let's highlight in pink just so we can have something different here. Sarcopenia, that's why people fall and get injured more with advancing age. It's because of the loss of muscle mass. They can't respond, they can't do things as well, and they're more likely to fall and get injured, break a bone, have problems. So I want to emphasize that maintaining muscle mass is actually a really important component of healthy aging. And when we talk about an article this week, PGC1 alpha, and you'll know that article if you haven't looked at it already, the emphasis of that article, my take-home message to you will be that healthy skeletal muscle, not just higher muscle mass, but also healthy skeletal muscle is an important component of healthy aging. And sometimes people don't consider muscle when they think about aging. They think about all these things that can go wrong and they don't talk about muscle. A muscle, because it is associated with nursing care, because it's associated with falls, is critical for healthy aging. All right, I just have one little last part here for smooth muscle. These are really short compared to skeletal muscle. They're just really tiny cells. They're all packed together in a way that as they surround organs, they can contract together and make the hollow organ have a smaller inside, or they can open it up. So some examples of this are the bronchioles, controlling the airflow into the lungs, blood vessels, either controlling what's what we call the resistance. It can control blood flow into one area versus another area. The bladder expands as it fills, and then the muscle contracts as it's trying to eject the urine. The GI tract is hollow. Think oral cavity, which doesn't really have smooth muscle, but we do here in the pharynx where we start to swallow all the way down to your anus. There's smooth muscle lining that, and the uterus has smooth muscle, and those are also all pretty good examples of that. Smooth muscle, the myosin and the actin are actually arranged differently, but they still cause contraction. But instead of pulling this like a skeletal muscle cell pulls end to end and shortens, but in smooth muscle, it actually causes the cell to do this, kind of twists and puckers. I think of it like wringing out a wet towel. And if you have a whole bunch of cells doing that together, then it can help to, again, you're controlling the size of a hollow tube or a chamber. So another difference, skeletal muscle, we had to have a nerve signal, release acetylcholine to get the contraction. While smooth muscle, nervous system can cause contraction, or it might just affect a contraction or a relaxation. Hormones can affect, local factors affect this. So there's a variety of different factors that can actually cause smooth muscle to contract or relax.